What is Web 3.0? I'm going to define it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the technological forces that are enabling it. And then I would like to talk about some barriers to this happening. So first, definition. Web 1.0 was a read-only internet. So this was the internet of like 1995 to roughly 2005, when people just went online and read content, but they did not create content on their own. Web 2.0 was the version of the internet where people created their own content. And of course, social media enabled that. YouTube, Facebook, all of that basically encouraged people to create the content in addition to consuming it. And Web 2.0 is still in place. That's basically 2005 to the present and probably a little bit into the future as well. But there was a problem with Web 2.0 that we did not expect, which is that there's centralized power in Web 2.0. So the definition of Web 2.0 is both content creation on the part of the population, but also centralized power. It's the fact that even though we create our own content, the places where we go to create that content are actually owned by these huge tech monopolies that have a lot of power to determine what we focus on, what we think about, and what we see. And lots of other things. This whole channel is about the problem with tech monopolies in a lot of ways. So we recognize that that is a problem. And Web 3.0 is basically where there's content creation on the part of people, but decentralized power. That's the vision. Now, I do have a critique of the whole concept of Web 3.0. Because you can ask the question, what matters? Is what matters that we have the tools for actually making decentralization happening? Or is Web 3.0 not going to be fully realized until there is no central source of power? And the weird thing about that is that in a version of Web 3.0 that's like the most utopian version I can think of, there's still going to be centralized versions of power. They're just democratically owned. So that's one problem. And then another problem actually is that it could be possible that we have all of the tools for a fully decentralized source of power. But there's some other power that's outside of the online ecosystem that's still the source of centralization. And you could imagine this as being a dictatorship where everybody in the country had access to these tools that were decentralized, and maybe they're even being used in another part of the world in a decentralized way, a very democratic way over there. But in this dictatorship, the government allows these tools to be freely used. It's just that people are afraid of, being sent to a concentration camp or being jailed or killed if they use it in a way that the government doesn't approve of. And so the question is that Web 3.0? Because the technology is Web 3.0 in that country. But there's a centralization of sort of fear and the things that lead to fear that might make that not quite what we mean by Web 3.0. And then the other point here is that there could be other forces besides dictatorships that control fear and human motivation in a way that's separate from the web-based tools. And if that's the case, is it still Web 3.0? So that's just a few caveats. But let me give you 5 things that are enabling Web 3.0 and 5 barriers to Web 3.0 coming on the scene. The first enabler of Web 3.0 is, of course, blockchain. And the fact that blockchain can contain smart contracts that are not owned by a centralized power, they're sort of owned by a large group of people. And the key with the smart contracts is that right now, one source of the power of tech monopolies is that they're the ones to enforce the many different social contracts and economic contracts that make their platforms work. So they have lawyers who will go after people for violating copyright, for example, And the existence of that enforcement mechanism is something that an individual actor sort of putting together their own platform would not have. If there were enforcement mechanisms that were sort of copy and paste from that blockchain, that freely available open blockchain, then that gets rid of that one function of tech monopolies. Tech monopolies no longer have a monopoly on contract enforcement. So that's not enough to disrupt tech monopolies, but it's one piece of the puzzle. The second enabler of Web 3.0 is probably the most important actually, which is democratic ownership of digital resources. So the biggest source of power for these tech monopolies is, of course, the network of people on their platforms. The fact that they own that network and therefore they own your access to your friends' posts and your friends', messages, that ownership of the network is basically the vast, vast majority of their power and their monopoly. So, of course, these companies are owned by shareholders, so there is distributed ownership of companies. That's what corporations are. If instead of distributed ownership of the capital, we had distributed ownership of the platform, where everyone who's using the platform had a stake or had a share of that ownership and could vote on the rules of that platform, vote on the way that platform evolved, that in some ways is the biggest thing that I think will happen to enable Web 3.0. Now, this doesn't mean that nobody will own capital. I mean, there are still servers, there are still physical buildings where workers of Facebook and Instagram work, but that capital could be owned by basically smaller businesses rather than this huge company that gets its power from the network. So that's the number one enabler of Web 3.0, if we can make it work. Now, of course, that does use blockchain as well. In fact, all of these utilize blockchain to make them happen, but I'm not going to get into that here. Now, the third enabler of Web 3.0 is going to be the existence of digital scarcity. And the basic idea here is that copy and paste is a huge problem for the creators of content. Like when I put up a video, anyone could copy and paste the code for my video, put it somewhere else. And so one of the pieces of protection that YouTube offers me is a suite of tools that make it difficult for people to copy my video onto a different video. And they also have, of course, lawyers enabling this. This goes along with the copyright, right? Well, if I have a way of making sure that nobody can copy and paste my product, or at least not copy and paste it in certain ways, that's going to give me a lot more control over putting my product out there, my videos out there, or my art out there in new forms where it can be protected in different ways. So this one is actually pretty related to the first enabler, which has to do with the enforcement of contracts. It's just if you combine the ability to put smart contracts on blockchains with the ability to protect digital scarcity, those two things together are going to disrupt tech monopolies. The fourth enabler of Web 3.0 is going to be the disintermediation of content curation. Because one of the sources of power for these tech monopolies is the fact that they're able to recommend content that people love. Like, your favorite social media companies, you go there and there's unexpected content that is really well matched to your preferences. And they can do that because they have access to your data, they have access to enough other people's data to make good predictions about what you might like. So any competitor to these big tech monopolies is going to have trouble competing with the curation of content. Now, this one actually also relates to the second enabler in the sense that getting this one to work where we can have good curation of content apart from the big tech monopolies is almost certainly going to involve having shared ownership of the network data, where there's democratic governance of how that data gets used. So if we can come up with other ways that are not owned by tech monopolies, but that are owned essentially by the people, of doing a good job of content curation, that will help push forward Web 3.0. And then the last technological enabler of Web 3.0 is going to be collective action smart contracts. And of course, smart contracts are going to go on blockchains where nobody owns the contract, but it's sort of enforced by a mutually voted on and transparent set of rules. That's the context. But I think a lot of problems we have in the world today are versions of collective action problems. And the version of this that I like to use on my channel is you imagine you're inside a company, one of the leaders in the company, one of the managers is really corrupt, and everybody knows they're corrupt. But nobody will report them because, of course, you're worried about the consequences. So they go on with their corruption, never being sort of identified, never experiencing consequences for their behavior. Well, the game theory of that, of course, is that everybody has an incentive to not report, but they're all hoping that everybody else will report. That's a prisoner's dilemma. If you can add a third option besides stay quiet and report, where that third option is I'll report if everybody else reports, then you can actually get rid of that corrupt manager because everybody reports at the same time. You have power, you have strength in numbers to actually enforce that, and you have protection for each person because you can't have retribution against all of them, or at least that would be way more difficult. So by changing the game theory of these collective action problems, you could actually solve some of the biggest problems in the world. Now, this one actually leads into my first barrier to Web 3.0. And that is the fact that you can't get these collective action smart contracts to work unless you actually have an enforcement mechanism. And that enforcement mechanism, that's actually fairly difficult to come up with. Like, there are solutions to this within companies, using lawyers, using the legal system. They have a bunch of solutions internal to the tech monopolies to actually enforce contracts. But coming up with ways of enforcing outside of that context is going to need to involve, are we going to use the legal system where we can throw someone in jail for not following through with a contract? Do we have consequences that we can actually impose when it's just the people getting together trying to enforce contracts? So I think that's one of the barriers. The second barrier is fighting convenience. Basically, to make a move from the super, super convenient tech monopolies to a different system, a different structure, we're probably going to have to endure some inconvenience for a while because the new tools are not going to be as smooth and convenient as the old tools. So is the population willing to endure that inconvenience? And for how long? Will they endure it for long enough to get these new tools up and running? And convenience is super addictive. So I don't know if that will happen or what would be the impetus that would get people to say, yes, I am willing to use a super inconvenient tool for 6 months while we work through the bugs. The fourth barrier to Web 3.0 is going to be mental infrastructure, where mental infrastructure is basically just people's understanding of how different tools work. Like, there was a time in history in the year 2000 when nobody would have understood what the like button, what the upvote, what the report sign, what all of these meant. You kind of have to get used to each symbol to where it's second nature and you understand how it works. This is just like you understand the symbols for bathrooms. It's just like you understand how a revolving door works. If you were to just go back in history and put in a revolving door in the middle of the year 1750, people would have no idea how that worked. So mental infrastructure is basically people's understanding of the system. And that has to evolve naturally and slowly over time. So the use of these blockchain tools and these smart contracts, that's going to need to evolve as the population takes up one new application at a time. So my question for you is, how long do you think this is going to take for us to truly disrupt the tech monopolies? And I know that's a tough question because it depends on a lot, including political circumstances and social circumstances, economic circumstances. I'm honestly saying it's going to take 10 or 15 years, maybe even 20. I think this is a long run thing. It's definitely not the next 5 years. I do feel hope in the long run, but not in the short run.